Thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and you're welcome to interrupt if you have any questions, and of course, feel free to reach out to me at any time. So I was tasked with talking about making connections with industry, and this is really more speaking from the clinical trialist perspective. And to show you my disclosures, you can see my list is not very long. Sometimes disclosures go up and they have like 20 companies on there. And so you sort of wonder, she doesn't have that much connection with industry then if she doesn't have that many disclosures. So because of that, then I decided to poll my colleagues in Boston. So this is really speaking to the experience of many providers that I asked, many clinical trialists that I asked in Boston. So I would put myself probably more in mid-career. I asked people who are on the younger side, junior faculty, and I asked very senior people. Those are the people who have like 20 companies on their disclosure form. And then I also spoke to the people that I know in industry about the connections that can be made between industry and academics. I should say that we must realize that the mission of academic medicine and the mission of a pharmaceutical company, an industry, what have you, are not exactly the same. So a pharmaceutical company is really driven by wanting to develop a drug that's going to make money for them, right? So you have to wonder, like, where does it overlap? How can we, these two entities which have seemingly very different missions, how can they collaborate together? And so even though there are different missions, we have to realize that there are complementary skill sets. So us in academic medicine, we're interested in drug development that can ultimately lead to better treatments for our patients. And a company's interested in developing a drug that's going to make them money. So in the magical Venn diagram of life, sometimes it matches in the middle, and that's where collaboration can work the best. So you, as someone in academic medicine, how is it that you ultimately think about a concept and bring it to fruition? So really, it starts with developing a concept, right? You have an idea, and this is just an example of an idea I had like a decade ago. So these are old ideas, but at least I've seen it through fruition. Okay, so you start with a concept, and in my case, the concept was thinking about mechanisms of resistance to VEGF inhibitors. So this was a decade ago where there was a lot of research into angiogenesis, but as you know, bevacizumab has limited duration of benefit. So one of the questions that I asked is like, what are the mechanisms of resistance to VEGF inhibitors? There were a lot of labs that were looking at this and continue to look at this topic, but there were a lot of labs looking at that. So then you have to figure out what is the data to provide a rationale for your concept. That data could come from your own lab. It could come from a lab collaborator within your institution. It could come from a lab collaborator at a different institution, or even it could come from the literature. And so there was preclinical data suggesting the role of SDF1 alpha CXCR4 axis in resistance. So we thought about potentially combining that with VEGF inhibitors. And so in this case, because of the mechanism, we were interested in looking to see who makes an SDF1 alpha CXCR4 inhibitor, right? And there was really one company that was making a drug far enough in development at that time. And so that's the company that we went after. So now that you have an idea, how can you actually access that drug? So first you want to figure out which company am I going to want to target, right? And when you think about approaching a company for that drug, you're also having to think about budgets as well. So we're really talking mostly about PI-initiated studies, studies that you're going to hopefully run where you're going to be the overall PI. Sometimes you might ask for drug only, but that means then you have to fund the rest of the study. And I'm sure you guys have already heard that clinical trials are extremely expensive. So it costs a lot of money to run a clinical trial. Sometimes you have to find grants, sometimes you do it through cooperative groups, sometimes if you're just going to ask for drug only, you're going to have to find a lot of funding for your clinical trial. In other cases, you might ask for some support from the pharmaceutical company, but typically that's not going to be enough to fund the entire study, so you still have to supplement. It's very rare for a company, especially when you're starting off, to give you lots of support, right? So just be aware of this, that when you approach a company, that they're not going to give you millions of dollars to do your clinical trial. So you have to start small and modestly. Another mechanism, which Eva Galinas just spoke to, is that you can also access certain drugs through CTEP, right? But usually that's if you're doing a clinical trial through one of the National Clinical Trial Network Consortium. So just be aware that's a different mechanism, but maybe not so much for PI-initiated studies. Okay. So you have now a concept, you have a drug you potentially want to use, you know the company that makes that drug. How should you approach the company? You have to realize that the industry, the company that makes the drug, has to be interested in your disease and your concept. Because even if you have the best idea, if they are just not developing that drug in your space, then it's not happening, period. You just have to realize those are the hard facts of the situation. It needs to fit within the portfolio for their agent and their funding availability. And so how can you figure out, is this within their portfolio? You can look and see what current trials the company is doing. It gives you a sense of what they're dedicating their resources to. You can also sometimes look at the company website, because they might even list where their interests lie and what sort of letters of intent they're wanting to solicit from the academic community. That being said, even if it doesn't necessarily fit within their portfolio, and you think that you have a really great concept, it shouldn't necessarily stop you from approaching the company. You can still approach the company. You just have to realize that they may not be interested, and you have to be okay with that. Okay, so how do you actually then make the connection with industry? So there are a number of different ways. If you have someone senior within your own group, it's really great to have that senior person introduce you to the company, right? Because if they have an established working relationship with the company, they trust that senior person within your group. That senior person is going to vouch for you and is going to say, here's my junior neuro-oncologist. He or she is very talented. I'm going to support them. So, of course, they're more willing to work with you if you have that connection with someone senior who already knows the company. But that's not always necessarily the case, especially if you come from a smaller institution. So it doesn't even necessarily have to be someone within your group. Maybe there's someone at your institution, but in the phase 1 group that's connected to the company. And maybe that person can make the introduction for you. So just think broadly across your institution. Or maybe it's not even an institution. Maybe you've met and collaborated with people from your connections at SNO, and you ask, Scott Plotkin, please introduce me to X company because I know you're doing a trial with that particular company. So just think about your connections and try to utilize all of those. Another way is you can reach out to the local MSL, and the MSL stands for Medical Science Liaison. Now, every company has a medical science liaison, or it might go by a slightly different name, but they all essentially do the same thing. They're basically the connection between the academic community and the industry. They sort of help filter things, and they can be your advocate if they like you. So larger pharmaceutical companies will have an MSL that's even regional, right? So a very large company might have an MSL that's dedicated only to the New England area. So you would go to the MSL that's for your specific institution, for that specific company that you're trying to target. You can stop by the company's booth if they're at ASCO or ESMO or other big meetings. Even if the MSL isn't there, you can go up to the company booth and you say, I'm really interested in learning about your pipeline, or I'm really interested in learning about X drug. Is there someone that you can put me in communication with about X drug? And so they can sometimes help at least give you a name that you can reach out to. And if all else fails, you can find contact information sometimes on the company's website and ask to be connected. So some of the larger companies, if you actually look or search for, say, MSL, it might even have, say, a 1-800 number listed there, or it might have an email that you can email, and you can say, I'm from this institution in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm really interested in X drug. Can you connect me with the MSL for that? And then the MSL will reach out to you. Okay, so let's say now you've connected to the MSL. How do you go about presenting your concept? Right, so the first line of defense in certain respects is that you speak to the MSL. You pitch the idea, right? It doesn't have to be very detailed, but you want to give them a sense of what your idea is, and you want to back that up with, proving to them that you can deliver on this concept, right? And so if the MSL thinks that your idea might be valid enough, or maybe the MSL has punted it to higher up in their organization, and that person feels like your concept could be good enough to perhaps move forward, then you're going to get a meeting with the MSL and other team members who are involved in developing drug X, right? So bring your whole team to the meeting, right? So if you have a senior person within your group that is your mentor, bring that senior person with you. If your concept is based on lab work that was developed at your institution, bring that PhD with you to help clarify the preclinical data that exists that supports your concept, right? If your proposed study has some cool imaging that you want to include, bring the imaging expert with you. So bring the whole team with you, because you're pitching an idea and you want to get it to move forward. You want to get it funded, right? So the more excitement you can generate for your idea, the more likely it's going to move forward. Okay, so if they like your idea after you've pitched it to them, they're going to ask you to submit an LOI, which means letter of intent. Depending on the company, they might have a template that you need to follow in order to submit this letter of intent. Basically, it's a synopsis of your clinical trial and what you're proposing, and an estimation of what you think it might cost to run this clinical trial. Right? And so if they review your LOI, they look at your budget. If they think that this is something doable, that they want to invest their money into, then it'll move forward, right? Then they'll say, okay, we want to see a full protocol along with a more detailed budget. So then you go through and you create a protocol and you create a detailed budget. And then ultimately, if they like this full protocol, they like your budget, the stars align, then you can proceed forward with your study. You have to realize that even the best ideas may not progress, that your concept can fail at any point in this, right? So I have had plenty of studies that we've made it all the way to protocol writing. We've given the protocol, it's a lot of effort to go through, and the company ultimately says, no, not for us, right? So just realize that it requires a lot of effort, a lot of time, and you're gonna fail sometimes, and that's okay. It's all part of the learning process. You'll get better every time you do it, okay? And I just wanted to end then on some advice that I got from these various clinical trialists, as I mentioned, that I spoke to. So some people strongly recommend getting a senior person to help mentor you. I will say that that's the way that I've worked in my career. I have very senior people that work at my institution, and so they've been extremely helpful with helping get my foot in the door. Utilize the resources of your institution. Like I mentioned, even if you don't have someone senior within your group, if you have senior people but maybe in a different disease center that are willing to mentor you, definitely utilize those resources. Get involved in your phase 1 group as well, because oftentimes they know about these up and coming drugs. And so, often they have access to drugs very early in development. Okay. If you're not a scientist, link up with bench top scientists to help provide that clinical data. Anytime you present a concept to a company, they're going to want to know what is the preclinical data that supports your concept. start small and be aware of budgets, right? So a company is, as you can imagine, they want a return on their investment, right? So even though we all wish we could, from the get-go, do these huge, large, randomized phase 3 clinical trials that are going to be practice-changing, those are very expensive to come by. So a company is probably not willing to fund you if you don't have an established track record. So you've got to establish that track record, and that means you start small with small studies. And then you build over time. As I mentioned, there are lots of failures, and it requires a lot of persistence. And clinical trials take a very long time to develop, to get going, to accrue, to finish. So I presented that idea of the angiogenesis inhibitor. So we did have a trial. It took 7 years, right, from start to finish. So it takes a long time, and even then it was a phase 1, right? So it was a very small study. I already mentioned it requires a lot of persistence, and you have to kiss a lot of frogs in order to find your prince. And that's it.